Welcome back to Reddit Audio Tales. Today's story is about a woman who cheated once, but ended up paying for it in ways no one could imagine. I'm Lauren, I'm 26, and yes, I had an affair 2 years ago, but the way John treats me now is honestly worse than what I did to him. He's turned our entire life into this prison where I can't breathe without him monitoring every single move I make. Between you and me, I think he actually enjoys playing the victim and controlling me like this. So here's what really happened, not the sanitized version everyone else gets. We've been married for 6 years together since high school, and honestly, I was drowning. John was this amazing guy when we were teenagers, but after we got married and had the boys, he just changed. He gained weight, stopped trying to impress me, and became this workaholic who came home exhausted every day. I try to talk to him about date nights or doing something fun together, but he'd just grunt and say we needed to save money for the kids' future. Meanwhile, I'm working full-time too, handling most of the household stuff and trying to keep myself looking decent while he's walking around in stained work shirts and acting like romance died the day we signed the marriage certificate. I felt invisible in my own marriage. Then Bryce started at our company, and honestly, he was everything John wasn't anymore. He was older, successful, took care of himself, and actually noticed when I wore something nice or got my hair done. At first, it was just harmless flirting at work, but he made me feel alive again in a way I'd forgotten was possible. John would come home and barely look up from his phone, but Bryce would compliment my outfit or ask about my day like he actually cared about the answer. I'm not saying what I did was right, but I was dying inside that marriage, and nobody seemed to care about that part. The affair lasted 8 months, and honestly, those were the happiest 8 months I'd had in years. Bryce understood me in ways John never did. He'd bring me coffee in the morning, send me sweet texts throughout the day, and actually wanted to spend time with me. With John, everything was about the kids, or work, or fixing something around the house. When was the last time he planned something romantic for just us? Never, but of course I messed up by sending that text to John instead of Bryce, and everything exploded. The way John reacted, you'd think I'd committed murder. He went full detective mode, following me around, collecting evidence like we were in some crime drama. Looking back, maybe I wanted to get caught, because at least then he'd have to acknowledge that our marriage was broken, but instead of asking himself why his wife felt the need to find happiness elsewhere, he turned it into this whole victim narrative where I'm the evil witch who destroyed our perfect family. Perfect family? We barely talked anymore unless it was about groceries or who was picking up the kids. I felt like his roommate, not his wife, and now 2 years later, he's still punishing me for trying to find some joy in my life. Everyone acts like I should be grateful he didn't divorce me, but honestly, sometimes I think divorce would have been easier than living in this emotional prison he's created. The day John confronted me with all his so-called evidence, I knew my life was about to become a nightmare. He had this whole presentation ready, like he was prosecuting a court case, with screenshots and timelines and photos he'd apparently taken of me and Bryce. It was honestly pathetic how much time he'd spent playing private investigator instead of trying to fix our actual marriage problems. But when he started crying and begging me not to leave, I realized I had all the power in this situation. He was terrified of losing me and the boys, which gave me some leverage to negotiate. I figured if I played along with his little wounded husband act for a while, things would eventually go back to normal, and he'd get over it.
Boy, was I wrong about that.
The list of rules he came up with was absolutely insane. I had to write this humiliating confession letter detailing everything that happened with Bryce, which was bad enough, but then he wanted me to give a copy to Bryce's wife. I mean, why drag her into our mess? That felt unnecessarily cruel, but John was adamant about it. He also made me quit my job, which honestly felt like financial abuse since now I'm completely dependent on him. The location tracking on my phone, the car GPS having to share all my passwords, it was like being married to a stalker. And the check-ins every 30 minutes when I'm out with friends? That's not rebuilding trust, that's control. The worst part is how he acts like these restrictions are totally reasonable. He'll say things like, well, if you have nothing to hide, why does it bother you? But it's the principle of the thing. I made one mistake 2 years ago, and now I'm supposed to live like a prisoner for the rest of my life? Meanwhile, he gets to play the perfect husband role while treating me like a criminal. He even made me cut contact with Jenna, my best friend since college, just because she knew about the affair and didn't tell him. Like, that's what best friends do. They keep your secrets and support you through difficult times. But John saw it as this big betrayal and conspiracy against him. Now I barely have any friends left because he's suspicious of everyone in my life. The no-contact rule with anyone from my old job means I've lost most of my social circle. I feel completely isolated, which I think is exactly what he wanted. He says it's about rebuilding trust, but really it's about making sure I have nowhere to go if I decide to leave him. And the intimacy thing. We haven't been intimate since everything came out because, apparently, he needs to heal first. But then he gets upset when I don't initiate other physical affection. It's like he wants me to beg for his attention while simultaneously punishing me for wanting attention in the first place. The whole situation is completely messed up. I've apologized a million times. I've followed his ridiculous rules. I've isolated myself from everyone I care about. And it's still not enough for him. Sometimes I catch him looking at me with this smug expression, like he's enjoying watching me squirm. Is this really about saving our marriage, or is it about him finally having complete control over me? Because honestly, it feels more like revenge than reconciliation. And the crazy part is, everyone acts like I should be grateful for his forgiveness, when really I'm the one making all the sacrifices to keep this family together. After about a year and a half of living under John's microscope, I started to crack. I mean, how long is a person supposed to be punished for one mistake? I was going crazy sitting at home all day with nothing to do except think about how miserable my life had become. At least when I was working, I had purpose and adult conversation and something to look forward to every day. Now, I'm basically a stay-at-home mom without any of the fulfillment that's supposed to come with that role. The boys are in school most of the day, the house only takes so long to clean, and I'm left with hours of emptiness to fill. I started small with testing his boundaries. Maybe I'd forget to check in exactly on time when I was at the grocery store, or I'd take a longer route home just to have a few extra minutes of freedom. John would notice, of course, because he's always watching, and he'd get that disappointed look on his face that made me feel like a child being scolded. But honestly, his disappointment started bothering me less and less. I began to resent how he'd made himself the victim in our story when I was the one living like a prisoner. Then I started a new job, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to have coworkers who actually enjoyed my company. There's this whole group of women who go out for lunch together, and they invited me to join them. It seemed so normal and innocent, just a bunch of working women grabbing sandwiches and gossiping about office drama. But when I mentioned it to John, he immediately went into suspicious mode, asking who would be there, where we were going, how long it would take. The way he questioned me made me feel like I was asking permission to commit a crime instead of just having lunch with colleagues. I decided to go anyway, and it was the most fun I'd had in months. We laughed and talked about everything except husbands and kids and responsibilities. For 1 hour, I felt like myself again instead of John's rehabilitation project. But of course, he tracked my location and saw that lunch ran longer than I'd estimated. So I came home to an interrogation about why I was 20 minutes late and who exactly I was with. His paranoia was exhausting. The constant suspicion was wearing me down more than the actual restrictions. Every conversation felt like a trap. Every explanation was met with more questions. And I could never just exist without wondering if something I said or did would trigger another lecture about trust and accountability. I started lying about little things just to avoid the drama. If I stopped for coffee on the way home, I'd say I hit traffic. If I talked to a male coworker about a project, I'd leave that detail out when John asked about my day. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because his reaction to innocent interactions had become so over the top that it was easier to just edit my life for his comfort. And that's when I realized he'd trained me to be deceptive. His extreme reaction to my affair had actually made me into a better liar because the truth was never good enough for him anyway. He wanted constant reassurance and detailed explanations for every moment of my day, but he also wanted me to somehow prove that I deserved his trust again. It was an impossible standard that I was getting tired of trying to meet. The worst part was how he'd act like everything was fine in public, but then dissect every interaction we'd had once we got home. It was like living with someone who was constantly gathering evidence against me. 2 years. 2 whole years of living under John's ridiculous surveillance system, and I was finally done pretending to be grateful for his so-called forgiveness. You want to know what pushed me over the edge? Jenna's bachelorette party in Miami. My best friend since college was getting married, and John actually had the nerve to tell me I couldn't go because Jenna was a bad influence who had enabled my affair. Enabled? She was being a good friend by not betraying my confidence. But apparently, in John's twisted world, loyalty to me was equivalent to betraying him. I tried to explain that this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, that I'd already lost so many friendships because of his paranoia, and that I deserved to celebrate my best friend's engagement. His response? Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to cheat. Like everything in my life had to be filtered through that one mistake forever. I was so tired of that being his answer to everything. Want to have lunch with coworkers? Maybe you should have thought about that before you cheated. Want to go shopping without checking in every 30 minutes? Maybe you should have thought about that before you cheated. It was his trump card for every argument, and honestly, it was getting old. But the Miami thing was different because he wasn't just punishing me, he was punishing Jenna too. And she didn't deserve that. So, I made a decision. I booked the trip anyway, and told him I was going whether he liked it or not. You should have seen his face when I said that. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't asking permission or trying to negotiate. I was telling him what was going to happen, and honestly, it felt amazing to have some backbone again. Of course, he completely lost it. Started talking about how I was throwing away all the progress we'd made, and proving that I hadn't really changed. But what progress? I'd been miserable for 2 years, following his every rule, and we weren't any happier as a couple. If anything, we were more distant than ever because every interaction felt like a test I was trying to pass. He threatened to divorce me if I went to Miami, which was honestly hilarious because he'd been holding that threat over my head for 2 years already. I called his bluff. I told him that if he wanted to break up our family over a 3-day trip to celebrate my best friend, then maybe our marriage wasn't as strong as he claimed it was. The look on his face when I said that was priceless. For once, he didn't have a comeback. Meanwhile, I'm packing my bags and feeling more excited than I'd felt in years. Not because I was planning to do anything crazy in Miami, but because I was finally standing up for myself again. I'd forgotten what it felt like to make my own decisions without having to justify them to someone else. The night before I left, John tried a different approach. He got all emotional and started talking about how scared he was that I'd cheat again, how he couldn't handle losing me and the boys. But honestly, his emotional manipulation wasn't working on me anymore. I'd spent 2 years catering to his insecurities, and where had it gotten us? We were still broken, just in different ways. I told him that if he couldn't trust me to go to a bachelorette party without cheating, then we had bigger problems than my affair. Trust isn't something you can force through surveillance and control. Either you have it or you don't. And clearly he didn't. Miami was exactly what I needed. 3 days of feeling like myself again, instead of John's reformed project. Jenna and her friends were amazing, and for the first time in 2 years, I could just exist without someone analyzing my every move. I barely even thought about John except when he kept calling and texting, demanding to know where I was and what I was doing. I started ignoring most of his messages because, honestly, I was tired of reporting my every breath to him. But apparently, that was a huge mistake because he completely spiraled while I was gone. He called my hotel room at like 2 in the morning, drunk and crying, accusing me of probably cheating with random guys in Miami. I told him he was being ridiculous and hung up on him. The next morning, he'd left like 15 voicemails, ranging from angry to pathetic to threatening. It was exhausting just listening to them. When I got home, he was waiting for me with this whole dramatic confrontation planned. He'd apparently spent the entire weekend convincing himself that I'd used Miami as an excuse to cheat again, and nothing I said could convince him otherwise. He demanded to see my phone, go through all my photos, and even wanted me to take some kind of test to prove I hadn't been with anyone else. I told him he was being completely insane, but he just kept saying that I destroyed his ability to trust and that my behavior in Miami proved I hadn't really changed. What behavior? Having fun with my friends? Dancing? Drinking? Apparently, in John's world, any enjoyment I experienced without him was suspicious. That's when I realized how sick our relationship had become. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a prisoner who was grateful for her chains. The fighting after Miami was worse than anything we'd experienced during the original affair fallout. He was angry that I'd defied him by going, angry that I'd ignored his calls, angry that I'd had fun without feeling guilty about it. But mostly, he was angry that his control over me was slipping, and we both knew it. I started pushing back more after that. When he'd demand to know why I was 10 minutes late coming home from work, I'd tell him it was none of his business. When he'd want to check my phone, I'd refuse. When he'd start his lectures about trust and accountability, I'd walk away. His reaction to my newfound backbone was to double down on the surveillance and restrictions, which just made me more determined to break free from his control. The final straw came when he tried to make me quit my new job because I'd been too friendly with a male coworker during a work event. This guy was married with kids. We talked about a project for maybe 10 minutes, and John had somehow convinced himself that this was the beginning of another affair. I looked at him and realized that no amount of good behavior would ever be enough for him. He would always find something to be suspicious about because living in fear and paranoia had become his comfort zone. It gave him an excuse to control every aspect of my life while playing the victim. I told him I was done living like a criminal for a crime I'd already served time for. He could either start treating me like his wife again, or find himself a new rehabilitation project because I wasn't doing this anymore. That's when he hit me with the divorce threat again, except this time, I didn't back down. I told him to go ahead and file the papers, because I'd rather be divorced than spend another day in his emotional prison. John actually filed for divorce 3 months after Miami, and honestly, I was relieved. I thought I'd finally be free from his constant surveillance and emotional manipulation, but I seriously underestimated how vindictive he could be when he didn't get his way. Apparently, all those years of playing the perfect victim had given him plenty of ammunition to use against me. The divorce proceedings were a nightmare. John's lawyer painted me as this serial cheater who couldn't be trusted with custody of our boys, even though I'd had one affair 2 years ago and had been following his ridiculous rules ever since. They used everything against me, the affair, obviously, but also my defiant behavior after Miami, my pattern of deception, and even my job changes as evidence that I was unstable. Meanwhile, John got to play the long-suffering husband who tried everything to save our marriage. The worst part was that John had convinced his family that I was some kind of monster. His sister, Rachel, who used to be friendly with me, started treating me like I was dangerous around the kids. She'd make little comments about how the boys needed stability and positive role models, clearly implying that I wasn't either of those things. Even my own mother started questioning my decisions, asking if maybe I should have tried harder to make things work with John. Make things work? I'd spent 2 years living like a prisoner trying to make things work, but everyone seemed to forget that part. The custody arrangement was the biggest slap in the face. Despite being their mother and having been their primary caregiver for years, I only got them every other weekend and one evening a week. John's lawyer argued that my affair and subsequent behavior showed I was too selfish to prioritize the children's needs. Too selfish? I'd sacrificed my entire identity trying to rebuild our marriage after my mistake. But apparently, standing up for myself after 2 years of punishment made me an unfit mother. The financial aspect was almost worse than losing time with my boys. Because I'd quit my original job as part of John's rehabilitation program, I had a gap in employment that made me look unstable. The judge ordered me to pay him spousal support, which was absolutely insane considering he'd been controlling our finances for years and had forced me into financial dependence. Now I'm working overtime trying to afford my own apartment while paying him money every month like some kind of penalty for wanting my freedom back. A year after the divorce was final, I found out through mutual friends that John had started dating someone new. Some woman from his workplace who apparently thinks he's this amazing single dad who is betrayed by his evil ex-wife. The worst part, she's everything I used to be. Young, naive, and completely buying into his victim narrative. I actually feel sorry for her because she has no idea what she's getting into. John's already started posting pictures of them together on social media, showing off his new beginning and his healthy relationship. It's honestly pathetic how quickly he moved on after spending 2 years claiming he was too traumatized by my betrayal to trust anyone again. But I guess trauma disappears pretty quickly when you find someone new to control. Now I'm living in a cramped apartment, seeing my kids every other weekend, and listening to everyone act like this is all my fault because I had an affair 2 years ago. Nobody wants to acknowledge that John's response to my affair was just as damaging to our marriage as the affair itself. Nobody talks about how his need for control and revenge made reconciliation impossible. It's easier to blame the woman who cheated than to admit that maybe, just maybe, there were problems in our marriage that went way deeper than my one mistake. But you know what? I'm done apologizing for wanting to be happy. I'm done pretending that his punishment was justified or that I deserve to live like a criminal. Everyone can think what they want about me, but at least now I can breathe again.